Today my sermon's about the Sabbath. And we have to remember that when Jesus was in conflict on the Sabbath, he was on conflict on the Jewish Sabbath, the seventh day of the week. Not the first, but the seventh. Here are these two stories from the Gospel according to Mark, starting in chapter 2, verse 23. On the Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they were making their way, the disciples began plucking heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to them, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and needed food, that he entered the house of God when Abiathar was a high priest, and they ate the bread of presence, which is not lawful for anyone but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath is made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.'" The second story, starting in chapter 3. "Again he entered a synagogue, and a man who was there with a withered hand, and they watched him to see if he would cure him on the Sabbath. And so they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, 'Come forward.' And when he said to them, 'Is it lawful to do good or harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill?' And they were silent. And he looked around them in anger, and he was grieved at their hard-heartedness of heart, and said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' And he stretched out his hand, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out immediately and conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him." I didn't really understand the Sabbath at all growing up. And I think it had to do primarily with the location that I grew up in. I grew up in a tourist town. And when you grow up in a tourist town, nothing stops on any other day. I mean, you make money when the sun shines. And so starting with the opening day of fishing season to the day they closed Tioga Pass, things ran. I guess it was the Sabbath was the day after Tioga Pass closed, and there was nothing going on in town. But then again, it wasn't a good time for the people who lived there, who worked in the tourist industry, because there was a gap between the end of summer tourism and the beginning of winter tourism, which means skiing. And those people who worked both of those, they had a month or two, and sometimes 3, where they had no income. And so it was a time of want, not a time of plenty. But the thing that I remember most about my growing up years was that when summer began, people came to church in work clothes. They came, hit the mark in their work boots, dressed for work, men and women both. They come to church, immediately go to work after church. And so it wasn't a day off for them at all. For many of them, it was just a time that they carved out, and they were there for that moment. The kind of this brief respite, and then they went on their regular day. I think it's really interesting is that the idea of Sabbath has just kind of left us as far as our own society goes. At one point, there were blue laws, places where you just couldn't buy anything on the Sabbath. You know, there was an understanding within the community that these things weren't open. Well, those are all gone. And then there was a time that businesses came back, but you didn't have sporting stuff on the Sabbath. And then football came along and became very popular, of course, and then that kind of blew that out of the way. And I remember when I first started my career, there was a lot of grumbling about kids' sports on Saturday. Soccer on Saturday, basketball on Saturday, baseball practice on Saturday. You know, you just make the list longer and longer now. And then on Sunday. And so that people were like, well, we'll never get the kids to school now because, I mean, sports is a sacred thing in the U.S. And so, you know, that's where the families were spending their time, watching their children run the soccer field, play the baseball game, whatever it was. You know, that's how people elected to do their time. What happens in society today is that there's really no difference between one day and another. A lot of people work every day of the week. Sometimes their days off can be different. For like a person who delivers bread gets Sunday and Wednesday off. A person who has an internet job, it could be any day, because someone's got to watch what's going on the World Wide Web to make sure that their little part of it is always running. People who work jobs that are on salary have seen the time that they have to spend at work expand to the point where if you're working around 60 hours a week, you're working the norm, which is just kind of amazing to me that there's an expectation within a lot of businesses that you're going to be available 1.5 times, half of that time for free. No more, we're not paying you anymore, but by gosh, if we need you on a Saturday, you better show up. And if you need to put in some extra time to get this project done, that's perfectly fine, because by gosh, we have you on salary, and that means we have you. Even hourly workers now are putting in more and more time in split shifts, which are just kind of amazing to me, that you work 4 hours in the morning and then you get 2 or 3 hour break, and then you have to go work the 4 hours in the afternoon. They don't pay you for the middle part, but you have to be available to come back. And so here you are, instead of an 8-hour day, you're into 11. And you have to just continue to work hard to get where you're going to be. Sabbath has just seemed kind of lost in our society. Julie's on sabbatical, which is a Sabbath, and so we've turned her free of the church, but right now it's peach season at our house, so she's putting in double time doing peaches, you know. So what is that really a Sabbath for someone? My great-grandmother, who I had the pleasure of knowing probably the first 25 years of my life, was a stickler for it. She used to get mad if I was working on the car on a Sunday after church. You shouldn't be doing this. You should be taking care of yourself. Granted that she used to spend half of the afternoon making Sunday dinner for the rest of the family. It wasn't much of a Sabbath for her. My grandmother, her daughter, laid down the law on about the time I reached young adulthood, and said, I am no longer cooking Sunday meals. You're on your own. And so it became my grandfather's hamburger night, that he would make a hamburger for himself, and that was his Sunday meal. What about you? Do you have a Sabbath that you adhere to? Or is it like me, you catch it where you can? I'm not counting the Sabbath as my work day, but I mean, in general, we are all extended in ways that are maybe not as healthy as they should be. Ways that we have to either put in more time doing something, or are caught between several different options that we feel torn about. You know, do I go visit them? Do I do this? What, you know, and so the decisions that we make always leave us feeling kind of in want or FOMO, fear of missing out, that we're just not going to get to all the things we want to get to. And people feel a lot of stress about that. One of the things that I have read in recent years is that younger people feel much more stressful in life than people did a generation earlier of the same age. I know, good for you. The idea is that there's always one thing more to do. I don't know if media's had made a difference with that, but I think what has really made a difference is the idea that our society never slows down. That there's always one more thing to do, that there's no differentiation between one day and the next, really. If you are in the business world, Target doesn't close, maybe on Thanksgiving and Christmas, but if you're a Target employee, you could work any day of the week, couldn't you? And you may be lucky enough to work 2 days in a row and have 1 day off, and then work another 3 and then have another day off. And so you really never can put anything together to the point where you're saying, I'm really taking care of myself. When I was talking to the kids this morning about laundry day, we have families in the church who say, it's hard to get here because Sunday is laundry day. And they're not kidding. They're just trying to catch up from the week before something starts all over again, feeling the stress of having small children or children in school, or trying to get ahead with their own life and just just making their way through the world? Where's their Sabbath? The two stories today, I think, are interesting because they show two different things. The first one is the disciples and Jesus wandering through a field eating the heads of grain, which I don't understand at all, because if you've ever eaten barley or wheat off the stalk, it isn't a pleasing experience, but anyway. And then he gives this story about David going in and taking the bread of presence out of the temple. It was not the temple, but out of the tent of meeting. Well, let me tell you, he could have been stoned for doing that. It's not like he was doing something great. It's amazing to me how David gets the great pass in the Old Testament. You know, it's like adultery, killing people, doing all this just basic mayhem. And it's like, well, but he listened to God enough. And so we like him a lot. And so he gets a pass. But here he does something, and it's not just that he creates and does this terrible thing as far as what he's not supposed to do, you know, ritually. He gives it all his men and makes them accomplices to his act. But Jesus lifts it up, you know, and says, hey, you know, a person's got to eat, a person's got to eat, you know. And I think God understands that. The second one is the one that really interests me. The kind of the test to be, you know, to see if the man will be healed on the Sabbath. Think about it. Here's a guy who everyone knows is maimed in some way, not quite all whole, and they set him up as kind of a test. And I kind of wonder about that. You know, was it truly a test, or did Jesus just notice somebody that everyone didn't? I think that the Sabbath came to this poor person in his healing because someone noticed him and reached out to him in love. To me, it's not the healing act, it's the loving act that makes a difference in the story. And even though Jesus says at the end that the Sabbath is made for humankind and not the other way around, it just points again that a good idea can get waylaid by our own good intentions. The Ten Commandments, one of the commandments is you should honor the Lord your God with all your heart. And you should, you know, and you should have a Sabbath. It's not a really complex law given right there. Pretty basic, pretty simple, you know, and follow this. And then over time, we take good ideas and we kind of make them more and more complex. We say, well, you know, really this is a good idea, but it needs more definition. And so what happens with definitions is they have a tendency of creating in and out groups that can do this and groups that can't do this, and people who are people who meet all the criteria and people who don't meet the criteria. And it happens all over the world, and it happens in churches too, that, you know, at some point someone doesn't measure up. And at the moment they don't measure up, they become an outsider. The hardest part for any kind of basic gift, which I think the Ten Commandments are, is to just let them be the way they are without putting all this extra stuff on top of them. And if it says to love God, what does that mean? And so the second story with Jesus, to me, is more of is it right to love at all times? And who gets the Sabbath out of this? Is it Jesus gets the Sabbath because he heals on the Sabbath? No, I don't think so. I think the person who really received the Sabbath blessing was the guy who was healed because he was noticed. And I think that's the healing act, really. It's not, you know, whether his hand was made completely normal or not there, couldn't tell you. But I know that he was normalized by an act of love in his life. And the Sabbath was bestowed upon him. Grace was given to him. A break was given. Someone recognized the plight that he was in and did something about it. Too often we think about Sabbath and things like that, similar things, as something that we just pull ourselves out of and get away from it all and find our happy spot and just sit in it a while. I really don't think that's it. Because, I mean, you can spend your whole time looking for a happy spot. I mean, I have. And it's just like, if I only get away from here, I'll feel better. And if I only do this, then it'll all be good. And what if, if those people do what I want them to do, it'll really be good. But the real reason, the real Sabbath, is when grace comes upon us. When something happens to us and we feel affirmed that we're human beings and that we're good people and that we have something that's valued and important and worthwhile. And that's the Sabbath we give one another. It's not a space and time. It's not a blue law that says you have to do this or that. It's not a law that says, well, you can't do this and you can't do that on a specific day of time. It's the time in which God's grace is bestowed upon another, and they get to rest. And we can be instruments of that. We can do good on the Sabbath by just being good to other folks and giving them that opportunity to find that rest for themselves, to be transformed even in our own presence. Because we, like God, have the ability to see people, to make a difference in their lives, and to be a transforming agent. Jesus transforms a man who has a deformed hand. He transformed him through an act of love. We have that same capacity. We are the Sabbath transformers through acts of love. Maybe Jesus was on to something. Will you pray with me? May we be a Sabbath people, God. May we bestow it upon others the way Christ bestowed a new beginning on the person in Mark. May we be those who see those who are struggling, those who are yearning to be set free, and give them the peace that they deserve. Grant that we would have that happen to us as well, that we aren't just givers, but receivers of your grace, that we too would know that you were alive in the world, and that the simple act of giving love and care can be returned and given over and over again. Amen.